Hi there, this is Dr. Everybody. Talk to you a little bit about computer project number 7. And this one, we've actually collected some data in 231. We've de-identified it, messed it around a little bit. But we're going to do a couple of things. One is do some calculations with it, and the most interesting part is look at a correlation between the in-class exercises and the total points, which of course represents the grade that somebody might get. And so in some sense it's like, is there a correlation between students coming to class and total points in the class? And not surprisingly, it turns out that there is a correlation, and so we're going to calculate that, and it's an interesting question to ask, and we're going to go through that and do a few other things along the way, in particular deal with lists and deal with functions. So we're giving you a text file, and it's a it's got, as it describes here, it's got the PID of a student. Obviously these are made up. The exam 1, exam 2, exam 3, the in-class exercises, there were 50 possible points for that, so we've converted however many were done into the 50. There's the points on the projects, and then finally the number of labs that were done. And so of course the number of points that a student gets are those 5 values, and the labs, we keep track of that because remember, if you don't do at least 13 of the labs, then you will lose. We have so we're working with lists here, and what we're going to do is we're going to read this file in, and we're going to make a list of lists. And so if I call my list something like data, I'm going to start out with an empty list, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a list of lists. And so this line here will be a list, and when we make it a list, there'll be commas in between these values, and then the next list, again, that'll be a comma between those, and so on. And then we will put each of these lists into a big list, which I will for the moment call data. So it is a list of lists that we have. And and so you have each one has a bunch of comma separated values, and then the lists themselves are elements of a larger list. And the way you do this is that in the function that is reading this in, is you'll start with an empty list, and then for every line in the file, what we'll do is we'll make a list, I'll call it line list, out of each line using the split function. And when the split has no arguments, it will split on white space, which of course is what we have here. And then you will append each of those data. That's my main list. I will append each of these lists that I got off of each line. So here we have a list, and we append that list onto my main list, and then at the end I'm going to return that in my function. Now this is actually not exactly how you're going to do this, because if I did this, this would in fact be a list of strings looking like this. And the reality is that eventually you're going to want at least these ones. First one, PID as a string is fine, but you're going to want these as numbers. And so right in here, I converted them to numbers and then appended that on. So that's the basic structure that we have for this project. Now, what else do we have going on here? Well, we have, we then, we've got your standard thing there about how many points and so on. And then we have a bunch of functions that we ask you to generate. And so the get data takes a file object. That was the thing I called FP in my thing, and it returns a list. And so since it returns a list in the main part of my program, I may say something like data equals that. So when that list gets returned, it gets captured in some data structure. And then I will take that data structure and I will pass it in to each of these functions. Notice that one doesn't return anything, so that means we change the data, and then I will then take that data, and that then ends up being an argument into the next one, and so on. And so I keep processing that data. And there's a few things to notice about this. Here you can see in this example, unlike the way I showed you before, these elements in the list have already been converted to integers. But this here is to show you, hey, I have a list of lists, and then when I calculate the grades, it updates that list to include each person's total points. And because we're going to sort later on by total points, I strongly suggest that you put total points in as the first element of each of these lists, because Python has a sort function, and what it does is it sorts based on the first item in there. And if we were sorting by PIDs, we'd want it like that, but in fact we're going to be sorting on total points. So stick that in the beginning. Where else you put the other stuff doesn't really matter, and you don't have to put it there, but it's just a handy way to do that. And then further down, we actually are going to calculate the correlation, and as part of that, as part of the correlation, you're going to in fact have to create both means and standard deviations of that, and we ask you to do those as functions, even though they are available in Python to do it for you. And it also happens that we use that up here, so we don't require you to create mean and standard deviation functions, but it's really the only smart thing to do, because not only do you use it up here, but you use it a couple of times down here, and it just doesn't make sense to keep writing that out all the time. So create those as functions. And what I'd like to do now then is take a look at doing that. So let's get rid of that, and let's bring up my my skeleton here. So let's take a look at the skeleton that I've created. And the one thing I did is I created a constant here with the grade cutoffs. Like 600 points is a 1.0 and 650 is a 1.5 and so on. You may or may not find that to be useful. I found it very useful to create a function that if you give it the points, like 680 points, what in fact is the grade that's calculated there, and I just found my program was a lot easier to read if I did that. Right now in my skeleton, I have to have something inside my function, and so pass is a nice way to do it. And you can also see here I chose to do minimum labs as one. Here's that get data like I showed you before. You start off with an empty main list for each line in there. You got all that. There's a bunch of stuff that has to be done. And then I put in, I made each of these exam 1, exam 2, exam 3, etc. In fact, I think that these might even be in a different order than was up there before. And notice then I made a list that I then appended into the main one and then returned that. The couple of other things here, you can see I've got my my main functions there, and then I created functions to like I calculated a mean on a particular column. I found that to be a handy thing to do, and then I made a standard deviation, and notice that in my standard deviation I call that calculate mean function that I just wrote up there. And in fact, in my Pearson correlation, I designed it so it took a couple of values that to calculate correlation on. Those numbers are likely different than what you have depending on how you arrange your data. But again, you have to calculate the mean for each of those, then you have to calculate the standard deviation. You don't want to calculate the mean over and over again. Create a function, same thing with standard deviation. It's just the obvious thing to do once you're comfortable with functions. The other thing that I did is I made there's a bunch of terms that are going to get added together, and so I actually made a list of those terms and then calculated the correlation, and then of course displayed it. So so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just show you one function. I'm going to do that function. Oops. All right, let's take a look at that. And so I have, the only difference between this one and the one I just showed you a moment ago is that I actually have something that reads in the data. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to open a file, and it gives me a file object. I'm going to pass that file object to the getData function. It returns data. And then I'm going to calculate the mean on what's in column 5, which for me at this point I think is the project scores, but that's just showing things. And then I'm just going to print out the mean that I calculated. So let's take a look at writing that function. All right, so calculate the mean. What are we going to do here? Well, I don't need that pass anymore because I'm going to actually fill in some real stuff. And I'm going to get a bunch of values out of some column, and so I'm going to make a list of those values, and I'm going to go through my data. So for each item in my in data, okay, so what is item? Item is a list of values, and so I want a particular one, and so I want the one that's in the specified column, 5 in my case. And so now I will have a list of all of the values in column 5. And how do I calculate the mean? Well, Python has a sum function which will sum all those values, and then I need to divide by how many of their, well, that's the length of values, and then I return that. Now, one thing that I'm going to do here, though, is I imported statistics, and so I'm going to say Python's mean. This is for checking purposes. And what is that? That's statistics dot mean of my values. That will let me compare. So let's fire this thing up, and my int object is not iterable. Values. I made a mistake here. That is a single integer. I needed to say that was stupid. Values dot append. Okay, obviously I'm not thinking today because I wanted to take my empty list and append onto it. Let's try that. That came out a lot better. Notice here that when I look at this, I see I printed out Python's mean as well as my mean, and you can see they're exactly the same. So I'm probably on the right track. And you can do the same thing with standard deviation. There you go. That gives you a look at this, and good luck.